Buenos Aires, 1960. The city pulsed with life, the narrow cobblestone streets crowded with street vendors, children playing in alleys, the distant hum of tango drifting from cafes. But underneath this ordinary rhythm, shadows moved with deadly purpose. One man walked through the city, appearing just like any other expatriate European who had found refuge in Argentina after the war. He was meticulous in every detail, his suit pressed, his shoes polished, the briefcase clutched tightly in his hand. Yet those who knew his history called him one of the most dangerous men of his generation, a man who had evaded justice for 15 years and whose name alone could send chills through survivors and governments alike. To the world, he was a quiet, unassuming man living in a modest apartment in a middle-class neighborhood. To those who understood the depths of the Holocaust and the machinery of death that had orchestrated it, he was a ghost whose actions had left behind nothing but pain and shattered families. The Nazis he had once served had crumbled, their leaders tried and executed, their secrets slowly unearthed. But he had vanished, slipping through the cracks of post-war Europe and finding sanctuary across the ocean, where no one expected the tentacles of justice to reach. In Israel, the memory of the Holocaust was still raw. Survivors walked the streets of Jerusalem, their faces etched with grief and scars both visible and invisible. Stories circulated of men who had orchestrated mass executions, who had directed transports to concentration camps, who had overseen factories of death, and had somehow survived. One such story had obsessed a small, dedicated team within Mossad for years. They were not motivated by politics, not by vengeance alone, but by a deep human need for closure, for the families who had lost everything, and for a nation that carried the weight of memory. The man in Buenos Aires thought he was invisible. He attended the synagogue on Fridays, greeted neighbors with a polite nod, and kept his movements as routine as possible. What he did not know was that Mossad had already begun piecing together his life from thousands of fragments. Witness testimonies, immigration records, whispers from local communities, and every scrap of intelligence available. They knew he had assumed multiple identities, changed his appearance, and cultivated a life that seemed ordinary. Yet even the most careful camouflage has cracks, and the eyes of a determined intelligence service were trained to find them. For years, the pursuit had been methodical, almost obsessive. Agents traveled across continents, interviewing survivors who could recognize the faintest hint of his face, following leads that ended in dead ends or false promises. Each clue was a thread in a tapestry, and the Mossad team knew that if they could pull the threads together, they could recreate a full picture of a man who had thought himself untouchable. The challenge was not merely locating him, but understanding his psychology. He was not reckless. He had spent years learning how to evade capture. One misstep, one unguarded moment, and he would disappear again, leaving behind only another trail of frustration and dashed hope. One operative remembered the first time he laid eyes on a photograph of the target. It was taken decades earlier, during the war, when the man had commanded units in Eastern Europe. The image showed a stark face, eyes cold but precise, calculating. There was no warmth, no hesitation, only the efficiency of a man who had orchestrated unimaginable horrors with unwavering resolve. That face had haunted the operative for years, becoming both a symbol of the mission and a personal burden. He could never forget the faces of the victims either, their silent pleas echoing through the corridors of memory. This mission was never abstract. It was intensely human. The Mossad team faced a city filled with secrets. Buenos Aires was a haven for many who had fled Europe after the war, some seeking a new life, others hiding from justice. Local authorities were often indifferent, or in some cases complicit, either turning a blind eye or actively protecting those who had wealth or connections. The agents had to move carefully, respecting the rules of diplomacy while pushing the limits of what was possible. Every step had to be measured. One mistake could expose the operation, compromise their cover, and send the target running, possibly forever. Late one evening, under the cover of darkness, the operative began to map the streets surrounding the target's apartment. Every lamppost, every shadowed alley, every neighboring window became part of a mental blueprint. He noted the routines: when the man left for synagogue, when he returned, which shops he visited, even which cafe he preferred on weekends. It was obsessive, almost ritualistic work, and yet it was the foundation for everything that would follow. The world would never know the amount of time spent waiting, watching, calculating. This was not a simple case of tracking a criminal. It was a patient orchestration of justice, a chess game spanning decades and continents. Inside the apartment, the target believed himself safe. He read his newspapers carefully, smiled politely at the concierge, and went about his life with the calm precision of a man who thought history could not touch him. He had survived chaos before and believed that survival was a matter of patience, of blending in, of trusting no one. He could not imagine that agents thousands of miles away had reconstructed his life from fragments, predicting his movements and habits with eerie accuracy. They were closing in, but not yet visible. The tension was invisible yet palpable. A wire stretched across continents, waiting for the precise moment to snap. And then a letter arrived at Mossad headquarters. Not an ordinary letter, but a carefully sourced piece of intelligence that changed everything. A neighbor, a former co-worker, someone who had interacted with the man in Buenos Aires years ago, had spoken under strict confidentiality, providing the first reliable confirmation of his exact address. The operative who received the information felt a surge of adrenaline, tempered by years of restraint. This was the breakthrough, the hinge upon which the entire operation could pivot. Yet even with this knowledge, the path ahead was treacherous. Every step had to be rehearsed, every contingency accounted for, every risk calculated. The final capture, or elimination, would be a test not just of skill, but of nerve, discipline, and moral certainty. The city seemed unaware of the silent drama unfolding within its streets. Children laughed in alleys, couples walked arm in arm under the glowing streetlights, cars honked impatiently at traffic lights. Buenos Aires carried on, indifferent to the storm of history converging upon one small apartment. And yet, beneath the ordinary rhythm of daily life, justice was preparing to make its long-awaited arrival. By the time the team finalized their initial plans, the night had deepened. Agents moved in quiet vehicles, shadows blending into shadows, rehearsing routes and timings with meticulous precision. The operative, who would observe the apartment from a nearby rooftop, felt the weight of the mission pressing down on him. He thought of the families whose lives would finally see closure, of the children and grandchildren who deserved the knowledge that a man responsible for unspeakable horrors would no longer escape accountability. The target, oblivious, continued his routine, unaware that decades of careful concealment were about to be challenged. Every door he opened, every step he took, every pattern he repeated, had been noted and mapped by eyes trained to see the unseen. The net was tightening quietly, inexorably, like the slow draw of a predator around its prey, and within hours, the next stage of the operation would begin, a stage that would either bring long-awaited justice or fail entirely, leaving the ghost to slip back into history. The confirmation of an address changed everything, but it did not make the work easy. It only sharpened the edges of a problem that had been jagged for years. The team in Jerusalem convened in a concrete room beneath Mossad headquarters, the air thick with cigarette smoke despite stricter rules in other parts of the building. Maps covered a table, photographs were spread like a fan, and a wall clock measured the silence between sentences. They moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had rehearsed the same restraint thousands of times. No theatrics, no heroics, no gestures that might be misread by a nervous trainee. The mission required an equation of time, patience, and nerves, elements that the agents had in abundance, but which never felt abundant enough when the stakes were measured in suffering and justice. David was the team's lead field officer. He had a face shaped by decades of service, wrinkles that looked like topographical lines of missions past, and eyes that never quite shifted when a lie was told across the table. He had grown up in a home where the stories of loss were repeating refrains, where each family album page carried a missing name. For him, this operation was not simply a career high or a line on a dossier, it was a promise. He carried the weight of that promise in the way he spoke, precise, economy of words, never wasting breath on speculation. He had learned that small talk was a luxury his line of work could rarely afford. Rachel handled analysis and logistics. She had spent nights cross-referencing ship manifests and visa stamps, following fingerprint archives and digging into immigration microfiche until the coffee in her cup had turned cold and bitter. Her work was the quiet engine beneath the mission. Moshe, on the other hand, had been born with the twitch of a man who could sense where a sound came from before anyone else. He was the one who could stand on a rooftop for hours and feel the city move under his boots. Together they were a unit, complementary, methodical, and bound by more than employment, a shared conviction that some debts could not be left unpaid. They rehearsed scenarios like musicians practicing scales. Would the target flee if approached in the street? Could local police be relied upon to detain him? Was a joint operation possible with Argentine authorities? Or would those channels leak and ruin everything? The room held the ghosts of past operations, both successes and failures, names that had been struck from active lists because of careless exposure, and the silent question that always followed. Once you start moving the pieces, can you control the game? The plan that emerged was not one of spectacle. It relied on patient containment, quiet observation, and, if fortune smiled upon them, a single, swift extraction. They would take him alive if they could, alive so survivors could see justice served, alive so testimonies could be given and names could be said aloud without the distortion of second-hand rumor. There was an ethical emphasis to the plan that sometimes surprised outsiders. Capture where possible, trials where possible, truth where possible. For a tragedy so large, the team wanted the work to be as transparent as prudence allowed. Back in Buenos Aires, the men on the street took different names and occupied unremarkable roles. They rented apartments under dead men's identities. They made cash purchases in neighborhoods the target frequented, and they learned the rhythm of a life that had been shaped by concealment. Mossad did not rush. They watched the man pick his bread in the morning, watched him stand in the shadow of the synagogue doorway on Shabbat, watched his folded hands tremble minutely as if memory sometimes reached into his routine and pulled at it. The agents catalogued not only his movements, but his silences. He would sometimes pause at the market and listen to conversations for reasons that were not obvious. He was cautious in ways that told the watchers he had once known fear and made it a tool, yet there were cracks, small gestures that suggested loneliness, perhaps remorse, perhaps only the human habit of aging. These were not excuses, and the team did not seek them as such. They were simply pieces in a portrait. The emotional center of the mission, though, existed not in the analyses or the plan, but in the faces of survivors. The Mossad team made contact with a handful of women and men who had lost family in the worst of ways. They were elderly now, their voices thin with age, but their memories terrifyingly intact. Anna was one of them. She had once been a child in a shtetl, whose name had been excised from most maps. She had survived by running and by the small mercies of neighbors who hid her for weeks at a time. When she spoke about the man in Buenos Aires, the room that listened was quiet enough to hear the rustle of paper. Her grief was ordinary and extraordinary at once. It was the grief of a life interrupted, of relatives reduced to names on lists, of children whose faces were never properly mourned. She wanted to go to Argentina. She wanted to stand in the street where the man walked and say his name, to look him in the eye, to see if any of the past's shadow remained in his face. The team told her it was not safe. They told her that watching from afar was the only realistic option. Her disappointment was palpable. Its shape stayed with every agent who had ever heard it. The operation was not simply a technical exercise. It was an act of listening, of honoring the broken stories that clung to each survivor's voice. One of the hardest choices the team faced involved contact with local Jewish communities. Buenos Aires was a city that contained multiple Jewish identities, those who had fled Europe seeking peace, those who had prospered, those who were indifferent to politics, and those who still bore the scars of old conflicts. Mossad could not afford missteps. They needed allies, or at least reliable sources, but the local landscape was complicated. Some community leaders were sympathetic, others feared retribution or the political consequences of exposing a former Nazi. There were whispers of complicity, of false papers being issued with the collusion of corrupt officials or opportunistic businessmen. The agents learned to navigate this terrain delicately, to take what help they could, and to protect those who cooperated with the utmost discretion. A betrayal in that environment could mean not just the abandonment of the operation, but the exposure of innocent people. The lives of informants were placed in the moral equation, alongside the obligation to bring the criminal to account. The target's small routines eventually yielded a detail that Mary, an analyst working at a distance, called the small miracle. He sometimes visited a park bench near a fountain at dusk, where an elderly man fed pigeons, and where he would sit alone and stare at the water. The detail was unremarkable until Mary cross-checked the fountain's location with immigration logs and discovered a line of residency records for men who had worked at nearby factories. One name matched an old identifier that they had seen in a wartime photo. It was not conclusive, but it was enough to force the team to reprioritize their observations. The bench became a window into a private hour. If they could intercept conversations or watch his face in that quiet place, they might learn whether the man had any remaining connections, an associate, a relative, a remnant of a network that still sheltered him. Or it might reveal nothing but the ordinary life he had built, and even that information would be valuable. The team moved cameras into positions that were legal in some places, marginal in others, and entirely clandestine in the most sensitive moments. The technology was never glamorous. It was practical, discreet, and relentless. The first close call came not from the target, but from an everyday accident, a malfunctioning tram bell that sent a crowd spilling into the street, breaking the careful rhythm of the target's steps. He clutched his briefcase tighter, scanning the movement with a practiced detachment, as if every sudden motion had the potential to contain danger. The rooftop observer, Moshe, felt his heartbeat accelerate as the crowd shifted. For a split second, the man's gaze moved, and, with his trained eye, Moshe thought he had been noticed. The scenario that every operative dreads unfolded in compressed seconds. Would the man look up, make the connection, understand that he was being watched? Would he change his pattern permanently? Moshe did not move. move. He had been taught to calm his reaction, to let the scene pass, because rashness breeds mistakes. The man did not seem to connect the dots. He walked on after a few moments, his posture a study in control. The team exhaled as if the city had let their breath go free. They rewired their assumptions. The event had been a test, and for that night they had passed. But luck is a fickle ally. A week after the tram incident, a different risk materialized. A local newspaper printed a story about war refugees who lived quiet lives in Buenos Aires, and the article included a photograph taken in the neighborhood near the synagogue. The image was grainy, but it was enough to cause sleepless nights among the agents. If the target had friends who read the press, and if any of those friends were sympathetic to him, the operation could be blown. The team acted swiftly to counter the risk. They redoubled efforts to maintain distance between the public record and the private surveillance. Small adjustments were made. Vehicles changed license plates. Meeting places were moved. Redundancies were built into the plan to prevent a single newspaper photograph from undamning months of work. The agents had to be mindful of collateral damage. Their moves could not endanger the people they sought to protect. As the days shortened and the sun angled differently across the city, the emotional temperature of the operation rose. The survivors pressed for news. The families wanted more than anything to be told there had been movement, some sign that the gears of justice still turned. David found himself having to balance the cruelty of truth, that operations take time, and that failures are common. With the human need for hope, he became practiced at delivering measured optimism, at articulating progress without promising victory. Sometimes, in the quiet after family visits, he would stand alone and watch the city lights. He would think about the numbers. He would think about names. He would think about how, in a world that had sometimes seemed to forget, a small band of people still believed the scales could tip toward accountability. The most delicate moment arrived when a local informant, an office clerk at the civil registry, offered them an unexpected favor. She had access to old residency files and was willing to slide a copy of a registration record into a mailbox near the synagogue, where the target met acquaintances from time to time. The team debated the ethical implications. Using an informant inside the bureaucracy is commonplace in intelligence work, but it still required moral calibration. If the clerk were exposed, what would that mean for her life? Would the cost be acceptable? Rachel argued that the information could save years of fruitless tailing, while David worried about placing yet another civilian into risk. They reached a compromise. The clerk would be given cover information and instructed on how to avoid detection. The team accepted the risk because the potential for closure outweighed the unknown costs. It was a calculation that haunted more than one of them at night. When the document finally arrived, it was a pale, yellowed page with neat, bureaucratic handwriting. It listed residency dates and an immigration entry that matched one of the aliases the team had been tracing. It confirmed that the man had been registered at a small boarding house in the early 50s under a different name. The discovery did not feel triumphant. Instead, it felt like a small step on a long road. It gave the team confidence that their portrait of the man's past was accurate enough to risk a move. They compiled their reports, checked their escape routes, and rehearsed the extraction once more. The moral weight of capturing a man who had once been an agent of systematic murder was heavier than any weapon. Each member of the team understood that law would have to be the instrument of accountability if they could bring him back to stand before it. They did not want to substitute clandestine judgment for the clarity of an open trial. As plans congealed into schedules, a new threat materialized, a change in the local political climate. A rising politician began making noises about national sovereignty and foreign interference. Rumors swirled that operations involving foreign intelligence agents would be highly sensitive, and that any perceived trespass could be met with a harsh political response. The team recognized that political winds could not be controlled, only predicted and hedged against. They accelerated their preparations while simultaneously building plausible deniability into their moves. They reached out through quiet diplomatic channels to ascertain whether Argentina would tolerate a foreign operation if deniability could be preserved. The answers came back lukewarm and cautious. It was not possible to rely entirely on diplomatic cover. Operational independence remained a necessity. With politics complicating the equation and time compressing around them, the team decided on a window of opportunity, a short period when the target's routine intersected with an international event that would guarantee lower local scrutiny. The plan was not reckless. It was a measured response to a narrowing set of options. They would not stage a dramatic abduction in broad daylight. Instead, they would choose a moment when the city's attention was elsewhere, when the target's habit of sitting by the fountain would make him vulnerable in an ordinary human way. The agents had rehearsed every contingency, the routes by which he could be led from the bench without creating scenes that would traumatize onlookers and without pointing fingers at innocent passers-by. They had also rehearsed the unthinkable. What if the target resisted? What if he attempted to flee? What if the Argentine authorities were alerted? In those scenarios, the plan called for retreat and re-evaluation. Their goal was to avoid violence and to bring him into the light of judicial scrutiny, if at all possible. The night before the operation's projected move, David visited Anna. He found her in a modest apartment, her hands calloused with years of hard work, her face etched with sorrow, but animated with a fierce spark that came when she spoke of justice. She wanted to know whether they would succeed. He did not promise success. He promised that they would try with full measure of their skills and that they would avoid bloodshed if it could be done. She clasped his hands, pressing them between her palms, as if transferring the residue of a grief that demanded agency. He left her with instructions to stay safe and to keep her phone off. Small, almost perfunctory details that cloaked the true human tenderness of the moment. He thought of the many faces he had stood before in similar instances, and he felt in his chest the small, terrible weight of the mission's meaning. It was not the weight of victory he carried, but the weight of responsibility. In the hours before dawn, the team took their positions. Mossad ascended to the rooftop that had offered him the first view of the man's life. He took his station, listening to the city breathe. Below, shadows moved like people thinking they were alone. Streetlights glowed, casting pools of amber that made the city look like a roadmap of small, private decisions. Vehicles idled in innocuous places, as agents became the anonymous furniture of the night. There were moments when the enormity of the work was so heavy that it seemed as though the world might tilt under it, and yet they moved with the practiced calm of professionals who had learned to carry the weight without letting it slow them down. When the man left his apartment that morning, he did not know he was being watched by more eyes than he had ever imagined. He walked with the measured gait of a man who had rehearsed his small movements for decades. He reached the fountain at the appointed time and sat, folding his hands together over his briefcase as if the object were an amulet that kept his past at bay. Minutes stretched and contracted like breath. The team's surveillance recorded each micro-expression, the way his jaw tensed, the way his eyes rested on the rippling water, the brief flicker when a pigeon startled. Everything that might seem trivial in a less consequential life became here a clue to temperament, a test of composure. Then, as if the city chose that precise second to put a thunderclap of fate into motion, a woman on the opposite side of the square paused and stared. She had stopped to tie her shoe, a small, ordinary action, and when she looked up, she saw him. Her face paled. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the two of them, and she looked at him not as a neighbor or an acquaintance, but as someone who had a name burned into memory. She clutched at her bag and considered speaking aloud. Mossad, watching from the rooftop, felt the hairs rise along his arms. This was the kind of unpredictable human moment that had felled even the most careful plans. The woman could alert the target. She could cause a scene that would scatter the patience the team had cultivated for months. Across the radio, David prepared to make a split-second call, intercept the woman, or stand down and let the chance pass. What happened next was not a cinematic collision, but an unwinding of human restraint. The woman did not shout. She did not reach for her phone. Instead, she turned away slowly and continued on her path, as if compelled by a force of private reason. She left the square, and the moment dissolved with the passing of her silhouette. Whether she recognized him fully or had only a suspicion that something in his face was familiar, the team did not know. They did not risk probing the moment further. The restraint shown by the woman, whether born of fear, compassion, or simple indecision, became the thing that allowed the team to keep moving. It was a reminder that while operations are built on technical expertise, they are always at the mercy of human unpredictability. As the sun climbed, the team tightened the perimeter in the most unobtrusive way possible. Agents took positions among the benches and cafes without drawing attention to themselves. They became the city's anonymous presence, the tourists with coffee cups, the elderly men who read the paper. The day passed with the kind of taut waiting that could fray nerves or sharpen them into a crystalline focus. Every passerby was catalogued, every pause in the man's walk noted, and every contingent plan rehearsed silently in the minds of those who had to act. The moral complexity of their task never lessened. They sought justice for crimes whose scale made language fail. They wanted above all to avoid the theatrics of vengeance and to bring the man into a process that could hold him accountable with the law as its instrument. As dusk approached and the city re-established its ordinary rhythms, the target rose from the fountain and walked back toward his apartment. The team followed at a distance, each step measured, each heartbeat synchronized with the slow, mechanical beat of a city that held its breath between streetlights and night. They were close. The moment of contact had been prolonged, delayed by human idiosyncrasy and political caution, but it had not been denied. At the foot of the building, the man paused, adjusting the strap of his briefcase. For a second, he looked upward, scanning the faces in the windows, as if to check for witnesses. It was the kind of mundane action that would later be described in detail. How a man who had once decided the fates of many checked the small world around him like any older person measuring the boundaries of safety. David signaled. It was time to act within the narrow constraints they had designed for themselves. The team moved like a slow, precise current toward the door. The agents did not run. They did not shout. They were practiced in bodily language that conveyed calm control, gestures that held neither threat nor invitation. Their plan was to surround the man and to lead him away without causing a public disturbance that would mar the moral clarity of what they wanted to achieve. But even the most careful plan can be undone by a single variable. At the threshold of his building, just steps from the stoop, something impossible happened. A child stumbled out from between parked cars, chasing a wayward ball that had escaped his grip. The ball rolled across the pavement, struck the target's shoe, and bounced into the street. For a heartbeat, the scene threatened to become ordinary. A child and his ball in the bubble of a neighborhood evening. The man, startled, bent down reflexively to pick the ball up and to hand it back. It was a small, humane action, someone returning a playful object. But to the waiting agents, it was a moment of peril. If the man reached down and bent, he might be unable to maintain control of the briefcase. He might spin and run. He might see movement that made him flee. In those tiny seconds, David felt the tension of all the months constrict into one thin string. He chose patience. He signaled again for calm, and the moment passed without violence. The man handed the ball back with a small, almost automatic smile that had nothing to do with guilt or innocence. He did not run. He did not notice the taut lines of the faces that watched him. The agents exhaled, but their relief was not a triumph. It was a temporary reprieve in a long, moral undertaking. The operation had navigated its first major hazards, but the true test lay ahead, bringing a man who had been part of an apparatus of death back to a place where he could be judged in the light of evidence and testimony. As the team escorted him away from the building, the city resumed its evening cadence around them. People walked dogs, businessmen argued about markets, and lovers leaned into one another beneath awnings. The agents performed the choreography they had rehearsed. Polite words, a soft request to come with them, a firmness that did not become brutality. They led him to a waiting vehicle and into the hush of a compartment. For the first time in decades, this man, who had once been almost mythic in his elusiveness, was in the hands of people who intended to see him face the consequences of his choices. But the story was far from over. The night that tightened the noose around him also hid other dangers. Possible accomplices, sudden political shifts, the risk of discovery by locals who might refer to the men in the car by suspicious names. The extraction required the same caution as every previous phase: speed balanced with secrecy, resolve balanced with an ethical commitment not to stain justice with vengeance. The team drove into dark streets that seemed designed to hold secrets, and in those hours, every passing sound felt like an omen. They understood that their actions would not erase the past, but they hoped, with a stubborn faith that had carried them this far, that they might force history to answer for some of its darkest chapters. The vehicle's engine hummed. The road spread ahead like a vein of possibility and danger. Inside, the man sat quietly, his face pale in the dim light. He said little. His eyes darted briefly toward the rear window, calculating, always calculating. The agents knew that the work was not over when a man was placed behind a window, that the legal, political, and moral processes that would follow demanded patience and an iron discipline. They also knew that for survivors like Anna, this moment, this physical containment, could provide a kind of closure that words had not yet managed. It was a small mercy in a world that had been filled with irreparable loss. They drove through the city while the night watched. Somewhere in a quiet apartment, Anna waited with the phone turned off in her hand, the way someone waits to hear whether a bell has tolled for a fate that had been long overdue. The team's radios were low, their language spare, their focus absolute. For the first time in many years, a man who had been sheltered by geography and forgetfulness, was moving toward a place where testimony, not rumor, would determine his fate. The extraction would be messy, imperfect, and complicated by the politics of the era. But at that precise moment, as the car's tires whispered on asphalt, the team allowed themselves a brief and sober satisfaction. They had managed to do what they had trained for, to turn a long, relentless effort into action. The real work, the legal pursuit, the testimonies, the reckoning, hadn't yet begun, but the first and hardest physical step had been taken. The courtroom smelled of paper and the thin metallic tang that seems to collect in rooms where history is about to be rewritten. Cameras were kept at a respectful distance, though the world would soon know the outlines of the case. For months, the team had prepared every thread, documents authenticated, Witnesses identified, chains of custody proven. Still, the moment the man walked into the room and removed his hat, there was a new, raw reality to what they had done. He was no longer an abstraction in a dossier. He occupied space in the world where other people, survivors and descendants, could look him in the eye and demand a public accounting. The trial was never going to be simple, nor was it intended to be theatrical. The prosecutor's office had two jobs: to narrate the truth with unimpeachable evidence, and to do so with the dignity that the subject demanded. The courtroom became a theater of memory, not a spectacle of revenge, but a public space where the past would be translated into the language of law. Chairs filled slowly with people whose names had been whispered in the margins of history, survivors who had collected pain like fossils, scholars who had catalogued the minutiae of wartime bureaucracy, and young people who had come to witness the mechanics of accountability. Cameras from different countries pointed lenses that were at once curious and solemn. The press wrote that the world was watching, but what mattered most to the team and to Anna was not the global attention. It was the moment when testimony could render concrete the fabric of crimes that had too often been invisible. Anna sat near the front. She had come not for spectacle, but for truth. Her hands, that had once scrubbed floors and sewn garments to keep a family fed, now trembled with a different kind of power, the ability to speak names that had been burned from calendars and to insist that the story be told fully. The first witness called was an archivist from Europe who walked the court through the network of documents discovered in the bank safe and the notebooks. With methodical, quiet authority, the archivist explained how entries matched transport logs, how names corresponded to locations, how the bureaucratic efficiency once used to organize annihilation now laid the foundation for proving it. The prosecutor let the archive speak. Facts have a particular weight in a room built for judgment. Then came the survivors. They did not enter the courtroom as caricatures of pain to be consumed by public curiosity. These were people whose lives had turned on a number of small, terrible choices decades before. The prosecutor called Anna forward, and as she rose, the room seemed to gather breath with her. She spoke slowly, naming places and dates with the terrible clarity of lived memory. Her voice trembled sometimes, but it did not break. She described the loss, the absence of names at the dinner table, the rituals that could no longer be performed because so many voices had been extinguished. As she spoke, faces in the gallery shifted. Some bent at the weight of grief, others in the audience refused to meet her eyes. When she finished, she did not look triumphant. She looked exhausted, but also steadied by the fact that her truth had entered a public record that could not easily be erased. Other witnesses followed. A former neighbor recounted seeing the defendant in his old uniform decades ago, providing a small, corroborating scene. A historian walked the jury through the machinery of the regime, the terminology, the hierarchies, the logistics, demonstrating how policy became action and how action became atrocity. The defense attempted to cast doubt on some details, arguing for the limits of memory after so many years, requesting strict standards of proof for every link in the chain. The prosecutor answered each question with a discipline that had been rehearsed in cold rooms and over long nights. Documents authenticated, chains of custody explained, survivor testimonies corroborated with archival records. It was painstaking work. Courts are designed for that painstakingness because the stakes are so high. Outside, tensions in the city that had housed the fugitive decades before simmered. Some newspapers condemned the operation as a breach of sovereignty. Some politicians used the moment to debate the ethics of extrajudicial actions. Others, especially younger activists and Jewish communities who had long felt the strain of silence, praised the ability of justice to traverse borders and timelines. The debate peeled through diplomatic channels too. Governments timid about anything that smacked of intervention weighed their positions carefully, publicly cautious but privately alert to precedent and moral argument. For the agents who had brought the man to trial, the public conversation mattered less than the facts in the transcript. They had acted on conviction. They now trusted the law to perform its work. The most wrenching moments in the courtroom were not the archival presentations or the legalistic wrangling. They were when former prisoners described procedures that had once been sanitized on government paperwork. A man with a soft voice described the arrival at a camp, the counting of names, the small humiliations that accumulated into a system of erasure. His testimony did not cry for vengeance. It requested acknowledgement, an insistence that what had been recorded as bureaucratic efficiency had been, in human terms, monstrous. As he spoke, the defendant's face remained unreadable, sometimes still, sometimes twitching with a repressed discomfort. He looked at the witnesses as if evaluating them for credibility. But the courtroom was not a place for performative contempt. The judge, stern and composed, kept the focus on the facts and the law, and the jury listened. Papers, maps, ledger entries, and witness statements. Each element a tile in the mosaic the prosecutors built translated what had once been method into culpability. By the time closing arguments arrived, the room had a new shape. It held a history that could no longer be dismissed as rumor or misremembered rumor. The defense counsel attempted to humanize the defendant, pointing to age, to the difficulty of recollection, to the gulf of decades as a mitigating factor. But the prosecutor framed the case in a way that was both legal and moral. This was not a trial about the good of any state or the failings of any era. It was a trial about accountability, about names that had been anonymous for too long, about the obligation of the living to tell the truth about what had been done. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom hung in an almost unbearable silence. Jurors filed in, their expressions impassive, and the foreman read the decision clearly, without flourish. Guilty. The words landed like stones across the decades. There were no public shouts of triumph, no victorious displays. Instead, there was a fragile, communal exhale, a collective acknowledgement that a small, significant order had been restored. Anna wept, not because the past was undone, but because a named truth had been publicly recognized and codified into law. For a generation that had watched names dissolve into statistics, naming a perpetrator in a court of law had a kind of restorative power. The judge pronounced sentence consistent with the statutes and the precedent, a legal closure that, while insufficient to repair the damage, validated the painstaking work of evidence and testimony. The aftermath required deliberation beyond the immediate verdict. Diplomatic ripples had to be smoothed. The governments implicated in earlier decades had to account for how such men had found refuge within their borders, and some issued statements acknowledging gaps in post-war record-keeping and law enforcement. Human rights groups used the trial as a platform to demand better archival searches, more international cooperation, and a renewed commitment to not letting perpetrators hide. For the Mossad team, the verdict did not end their responsibilities. They had to ensure that all records were preserved, that witnesses were supported, and that the operation's legal record would stand up to future scrutiny. Victory in a courtroom is never simple. It comes with obligations to history and to the living who had told their stories. David, in the quiet months that followed, found himself revisiting the faces he had carried through the operation. He visited Anna a few times, sometimes sitting with her in silence, other times discussing small, practical matters, testimony transcripts, travel reimbursements for witnesses, and arrangements for memorials. He did not imagine that personal visits could heal trauma, but he also knew that gestures of presence mattered. Anna's life, like many survivors, continued with grief as a companion. The trial gave her a kind of record, a public recognition that those whose lives had been consumed by loss had nevertheless been heard. The team's internal reckonings were not public. They held private debriefings where they talked about choices, about risk, and about the moral calculus that had guided them. They confessed sleepless nights and the small compromises that had felt necessary in the moment but uneasy in memory. Some agents found that the weight of the mission left a residue that no tribunal could clear. Others found solace in the fact that they had acted to convert private agony into public record. For many of them, the work was simply what it had always been, constrained by law, motivated by memory, and performed in the knowledge that the past, however resistant, could be made to speak. Across the globe, younger generations watched the proceedings and debated what the verdict meant for collective memory. Universities held panels on the ethics of transnational justice. Museums curated exhibits that put the trial into context, showing how bureaucracy and modernity could be twisted toward atrocity, and how the same bureaucratic records, when recovered, became the scaffolding for accountability. The cultural conversation shifted slightly, not toward triumphalism, but toward vigilance, a recognition that the structures of everyday life, paperwork, identity systems, transportation networks could be manipulated for harm, and that preserving archives was a form of resistance. The legal consequences extended further. The trial encouraged other jurisdictions to reopen cold cases, to look through archives with renewed energy, and to coordinate across borders. The precedent was not a simple legal lever for extrajudicial action. It was evidence that patient investigation combined with a commitment to the rule of law could force the world to address old crimes even when the living had turned their faces away. For the families of victims, the verdict did not bring back the dead, but it did create a public ledger of culpability. Names that had been reduced to statistics regained the dignity of being attached to human stories, and that mattered in ways that were difficult to quantify. Years later, memorials were erected and plaques installed near the courthouse. Survivors who had testified in the trial appeared at commemorative events, sometimes in wheelchairs, sometimes supported by family members. Students visited, making notes and asking questions that were both urgent and painfully naive, questions about how human beings could make such choices and what could be done to prevent them. Those conversations were exactly what the trial had opened, a civic reflection on how memory, law, and moral responsibility intertwine. David retired eventually, but he never stopped visiting file rooms and rare archives. He kept notes that would one day be donated to historical collections, not as a self-aggrandizing act, but as a way to ensure that the fragile documentation of operations, interviews, and decisions remained available for scrutiny. He wanted the record to be complete, messy as it might be, because honesty is a necessary defense against myth. His colleagues scattered, some to academic positions, others to quieter forms of public service, each shaped by the truth that their work had taught them, that justice, like memory, requires deliberate tending. Anna lived long enough to see memorials built, to hear her grandchildren ask questions, to watch the way a verdict could ripple through a family like water through sand, slow, altering, persistent. She spoke at events, not as a vindictive voice, but as someone who had insisted on being recognized. Her life, scarred but intact, became part of the communal memory that the courthouse had helped to formalize. The man, no longer a phantom in the post-war dark, completed his sentence. He died an old man, his life marked not by the ghostly freedom he once enjoyed, but by the fact that he had been named, judged, and recorded in the annals of accountability. That end was not tidy. It did not wipe away the enormity of loss he had helped construct. It offered, instead, a final page that made it harder for history to forget. The sentence did not make amends, nor could it. It carved a legal boundary around a moral truth, and in doing so honored those who had insisted on testimony and evidence. When historians later wrote of the case, they did so with a cautious admiration for the patient work that unearthed documents and memories, and also with a critical eye toward the moral choices intelligence services must make. The story became a complex chapter in the narrative of post-war justice, one that balanced the necessity of chasing perpetrators with the imperatives of law and diplomacy. It served as a lesson that justice is rarely instantaneous and never simple, but it is possible when determination, evidence, and the courage of survivors align. Years after the trial, in a quiet room with afternoon light on the desk, David took out a small, worn photograph, one of many, that had accompanied their early investigations. The man in the photo was younger then, sharp and certain, a face that had once represented ideology and the machinery of violence. David turned the photo over, read the penciled note on the back, and placed it in a folder destined for an archive. He thought of Anna, of the quiet, uncompromising courage of witnesses, and of the small, incremental ways the world had been nudged toward truth. He thought of the moral cost, of the choices that had to be made, and of the stubborn belief that had carried them forward, that names matter, that records matter, and that telling the truth, however late, is a form of reparation. The operation had been messy and human and deeply consequential. It had required secrecy and exposure in equal measure. It had forced difficult choices and had yielded both legal accountability and social reflection. For those who had lived through the trial, the verdict was not an endpoint, but a prompt to continue remembering, documenting, and teaching. Memory, they discovered, is not passive. It requires work, patience, and sometimes the fierce commitment of a few who will not let history soften into forgetfulness. In the end, justice did not arrive as a thunderbolt. It arrived as a long, persistent project, one that moved people, documents, and testimony across borders and through decades. The verdict became part of a wider ledger of accountability, a single line in a long book of remembrance that survivors, historians, and citizens would keep open. The case remained a reminder that the arc of justice is long, that the work of naming and testifying can pierce the armor of time, and that the human world, when it decides to remember, can still shape the terms of its own moral landscape.